They thought the front was safe, until papers began falling from the sky, each one calling soldiers by name, exposing truths only their families could know. In a war of tanks and guns, how did words become the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield? December 1944, the Ardennes forest. A brutal winter grips Belgium as American forces hold their frozen positions, unaware that a new front of war is about to open, one without bullets, but just as deadly. At first, it seemed harmless. Scattered papers fluttering through the wind, caught in branches, half buried in snow. Soldiers thought they were simple surrender leaflets, the kind the Germans often drop before an attack. But when the first man picked one up, the silence in the trench deepened. The leaflet wasn't about surrender. It was personal. It began with the soldier's name, then his hometown, his street, even the name of the factory where his father worked. The words were written in perfect English, almost conversational, but the message beneath was sharp, designed to wound, not with fear, but with truth twisted just enough to hurt. Within days, hundreds of similar leaflets began appearing. Some carried false newspaper headlines suggesting cities back home were in turmoil. Others whispered that American leaders were preparing to abandon the front. But the most disturbing were those that struck at the deepest fractures of American society. African American troops found messages claiming that they were fighting for a freedom denied to them at home. Working-class soldiers read that wealthy Americans were safe behind desks while they froze in Europe. Others saw forged letters that mentioned their own families, describing hardships that mirrored reality. Mothers ill, fathers unemployed, wives struggling. Each message felt impossible to ignore. The level of detail was terrifying. How could the enemy know so much? Word spread quickly through the frozen camps. Some soldiers laughed it off, calling it a desperate trick. Others burned the leaflets without reading a word. But a quiet unease began to grow. The Germans weren't just firing shells, they were firing doubts straight into the minds of men. What made it worse was how real it all felt. Some soldiers received messages mentioning events that had happened just weeks earlier. Hometown strikes, newspaper quotes, even weather reports from back in the States. These weren't random attempts to confuse. Someone, somewhere, understood American life too well. By mid-December, as the Battle of the Bulge approached, commanders began noticing a subtle shift. Morale reports mentioned growing tension in certain units. Whispered rumors about spies circulated through the lines. Some believed mail from home was being intercepted. Others wondered if someone inside the army was leaking information. In war, trust is survival. And now, that trust was cracking. The Ardennes was already a nightmare. Snow so thick soldiers could barely move. Nights so cold they feared falling asleep. But beneath the frost, another kind of chill began to spread. A sense that the enemy wasn't just across the trees. He was inside their thoughts. In one sector, soldiers awoke to find posters nailed to trees. The headlines were bold. America divided. Who are you fighting for? The text below listed American racial tensions, labor strikes, and political disagreements. The tone was persuasive, calm, almost reasonable. The language of someone who knew how Americans spoke, how they argued, how they thought. Psychological warfare wasn't new, but this was different. It wasn't loud or crude. It was intimate, designed not to terrify, but to fracture. Military intelligence soon confirmed what soldiers already suspected. The Germans were using captured mail routes, old addresses, even stolen newspapers. But that didn't explain the depth of detail. Some of these pamphlets carried stories from towns so small they barely appeared on a map. Was someone feeding the enemy information? Or had the Germans found a way to read American mail? Investigators began collecting the leaflets.
Analysts compared handwriting, layout, and tone. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, more sophisticated than anything they'd seen. Each piece of propaganda felt tailor-made for its target, and that was what made it terrifying. In the trenches, men began glancing at each other differently. The idea that someone might be listening, or worse, cooperating, began to poison the air.
The leaflets came by night, drifting silently over snow and wire. By dawn, they were everywhere, tucked into helmets, pinned to supply crates, folded between rations. Some came dropped by aircraft, others floated in via balloons. But no one ever saw who sent them. They simply appeared, like a whisper in the dark. Commanders ordered them destroyed, but curiosity always won. Every soldier wanted to know, what did the enemy think he knew? This was no longer just a fight for land, it was a fight for perception, a war where truth itself became a weapon. The Battle of the Bulge would soon test every ounce of American strength. But before the first shot was fired, another battle had already begun, one waged in the silence between doubt and belief. No one yet knew its name. No one knew who orchestrated it. But those frozen leaflets were the first signs of something larger, an invisible front hidden behind every word, every rumor, every fear. The propaganda war had begun. While American soldiers in the Ardennes searched for answers, hundreds of miles away in Germany, one man already knew how deeply his work had begun to cut. His name was George Werner, a scholar turned strategist, the quiet architect of a weapon built not from steel, but from understanding. Long before the war began, Werner had walked the streets of Chicago.
In the early 1930s, he was just another foreign student, polite, curious, and observant. He attended lectures in sociology and mass communication, blending in easily with American classmates. But behind his calm demeanor, he was collecting something far more valuable than any textbook could offer.
Werner was studying a nation's soul. He listened to how Americans debated, how they trusted, and how they divided. He studied how newspapers framed stories, how politicians courted emotions, and how rumors shaped opinion. He watched factory strikes, listened to radio talk shows, and spent long hours in libraries reading about the Great Depression. By the time he returned to Germany in 1939, he carried more than knowledge. He carried a blueprint. To him, America was powerful but fractured, diverse, ambitious, but restless beneath its own ideals. He believed that every democracy carried within it the seeds of doubt, and that those doubts could be turned into weapons. When war came, Werner's insights caught the attention of senior officers in Berlin. Unlike many of his peers, he didn't promise victories through firepower. He promised disruption, confusion, mistrust. He proposed something bold, a psychological campaign aimed not at breaking bodies, but belief. He called it a war for the American mind. In 1942, the High Command approved his idea. A small compound outside Frankfurt was quietly converted into a research and production facility, a place that officially did not exist. Behind its concrete walls, linguists, artists, printers, and analysts gathered under Werner's direction. Many were fluent in English. Some had lived in America before the war. A few were German Americans stranded in Europe when the conflict began. Werner handpicked them all. Every member of his unit brought a piece of America into that room. Accents, slang, mannerisms, fragments of memory. Combined, they formed something powerful: authenticity. Their mission was precise: to study American soldiers, not as enemies, but as individuals, to understand what frightened them, what angered them, what made them question the cause they fought for. Werner spent hours reading intercepted mail, captured diaries, and Allied newspapers smuggled through neutral countries. He analyzed troop publications, cartoons, even Hollywood scripts. To him, every story was a clue, every grievance a possible opening. What made his operation dangerous wasn't just intelligence, it was empathy. He understood the people he targeted. He knew their humor, their frustrations, their longing for home, and he turned those emotions into instruments of control. Soon, the facility became a hive of activity. Printers worked day and night. Leaflets rolled off the presses by the thousands, each tailored to a specific unit, a specific mood. Radio engineers recorded voices that sounded unmistakably American. Every word was weighed, tested, refined, stripped of anything foreign. Werner often told his team that the most effective lie is the one that feels familiar. He ordered them to use real names of American cities, actual headlines, and references to genuine events. His agents combed through captured letters for details about families and friends. Then they stitched those fragments together into carefully crafted messages. Each leaflet, each broadcast carried a whisper of truth, enough to make every soldier wonder if maybe, just maybe, the enemy understood them better than their own leaders did. By 1944, the campaign was fully operational. The results were unsettling. Reports from the front confirmed that soldiers were discussing the leaflets. Commanders were alarmed by how precisely they seemed to hit personal nerves. Werner's superiors saw this as proof of success. They expanded his resources, giving him access to intelligence reports and decoded Allied material. But Werner wanted more. He wasn't satisfied with confusion. He wanted disillusion. He wanted to make Americans see their country as fractured, faith as misplaced, and leadership as false. He saw America's diversity not as strength, but as weakness, a collection of groups bound by convenience rather than conviction. His plan was simple: remind each soldier of what set him apart until he forgot what held him together. Inside that secret facility, maps of American hometowns hung beside psychological charts. Analysts marked regions by class, race, and religion, not for invasion, but for persuasion. The scope of his ambition was staggering. Werner didn't seek to defeat armies. He sought to erode identity. By late summer 1944, his operation had the approval of Germany's highest command. They believed propaganda could stall the Allied advance, or at least slow the heart of it. Few knew Werner by name. Fewer still understood how much damage his ideas could cause. Yet from his quiet office outside Frankfurt, he had found a way to reach across continents, across trenches, and into the minds of men he would never meet. Every leaflet that landed in snow began in that room. Every forged headline, every whispered broadcast was his creation. The soldiers in the Ardennes never knew his face, but their doubts, their unease, those were his fingerprints. And as the winter deepened, his weapon was only beginning to take shape. Summer 1944. France was burning its way toward liberation. American columns rolled through shattered towns, confident that victory was now only a matter of time. But even as the Allies advanced on the ground, a quieter enemy campaign was already underway, one designed not to stop tanks, but to fracture belief. It began in whispers. Reports from forward units mentioned strange pamphlets found in captured villages, leaflets printed on fine paper, written in fluent English, claiming to be from concerned citizens back home. At first, few paid attention. The front was full of rumor and deception. But soon, the messages took a darker turn. Some leaflets carried headlines suggesting America's economy was collapsing under wartime debt. Others claimed strikes had erupted in major cities. A few even mentioned the names of U.S. senators and officials, quoting them out of context, twisting their words into warnings. Then the focus shifted from national politics to something far more personal. One morning near Saint-Lô, soldiers of an African-American engineer battalion discovered leaflets pinned to broken fences. The message was direct. Why fight for freedom in Europe when you can't have it at home? It listed recent racial clashes, real events taken from newspapers. It named towns, dates, and incidents. For some, it was shocking. For others, it hit too close to truth. In another sector, infantry units found pamphlets addressed to working men in uniform. These leaflets reminded them that while they froze and bled for victory, the wealthy were safe, their children untouched by war. "You fight for their profits," one line read. "They fight for nothing." Jewish soldiers, too, received a different kind of message, insidious and cruel. The text claimed that their government saw them only as symbols, that they were being used for propaganda while their people still suffered in Europe. It ended with a forged quote from a real American politician questioning the cost of war.
Each message was tailored, precise, and emotionally charged. The Germans weren't speaking to an army, they were speaking to individuals. At night, the leaflets came drifting down from planes. By morning, they were everywhere, caught in trees, stuck to helmets, scattered across muddy roads. Some carried illustrations copied from real American magazines. Others imitated the tone of familiar news bulletins. The Germans called it Operation Scorpion, a campaign meant to sting, not strike. Its goal was to slip beneath armor into doubt. But propaganda wasn't limited to paper. Soon strange radio broadcasts began reaching Allied lines.
Tuned between official frequencies, soldiers heard voices that sounded American, smooth, confident, and calm. They introduced themselves as former GIs, now seeing the truth from German captivity. They spoke of futility, of wasted lives, of leaders who lied. The broadcasts used American slang, American humor, even popular songs, before delivering subtle messages of despair. "Why die for men who will forget your name?" one announcer asked. "Why fight a war your own nation doesn't understand?" The timing was deliberate. These programs aired late at night, when soldiers were exhausted, half listening, half dreaming. The enemy understood that fatigue made truth flexible. Soon, loudspeakers began appearing along the front. Under cover of darkness, German units rolled mobile trucks near the line, playing swing music, the kind soldiers loved from home. But just as the melody softened their guard, a new voice would fade in, calm, reasonable, persuasive. "Lay down your arms," it said. "You'll be treated fairly. The war is lost already. Why die now?" Some soldiers laughed. Others turned away. But each message planted a seed, and seeds grow best in uncertainty. The real shock came weeks later. Analysts in the Psychological Warfare Division began examining captured leaflets more closely. Hidden in the text were details that no enemy should have known: recent troop movements, unit numbers, and even names of company commanders. Some pamphlets referred to specific incidents that had occurred only days before. The accuracy was alarming. It suggested that someone, somewhere, had access to Allied communication. How could the enemy know that an artillery unit had just rotated? How could they know the hometown of a newly arrived platoon leader? None of it made sense. Counterintelligence officers launched an immediate investigation. They checked mail channels, censored letters, and questioned messengers. But nothing explained the precision, even the tone of the leaflets, friendly, casual, conversational, felt eerily authentic. The possibility no one wanted to say aloud now seemed undeniable. Was there a traitor among them? In one sector, soldiers began burning their letters from home, afraid the enemies somehow read them. Commanders warned against overreaction, but anxiety spread faster than fire. Werner's operation was working exactly as designed. It didn't need soldiers to surrender. It needed them to question, to hesitate, to feel alone in a cause they once believed in. Psychological reports from frontline chaplains noted subtle changes: rising suspicion, unease, moments of anger between units. Some troops argued over the truth behind the leaflets. Others grew silent, unwilling to admit how much the words lingered. Even seasoned officers found themselves unsettled. The propaganda wasn't crude or childish. It didn't shout or mock. It reasoned. It sympathized. It understood. And that was what made it dangerous. By the time the leaflets reached the Ardennes, the campaign had matured into something chillingly efficient. No longer just drops of paper. They were calculated strikes, each one guided by deep psychological insight. The Americans had never faced an enemy like this, one who fought not to destroy, but to divide. As the Allied lines prepared for winter, few realized that the real storm had already begun, not in the sky, but in their minds. Behind every broadcast, every leaflet, every whisper of doubt, one unseen figure directed it all from a quiet office near Frankfurt. His name remained unknown to them, but his words, printed and spoken, had already entered their thoughts.
The discovery came by accident. A captured German courier near Aachen was found carrying a small notebook. Inside were notes about printing schedules, voice recordings, and lists of English names, not German ones. Among them were American ranks, service numbers, and even camp references. When analysts compared the details, a chilling pattern emerged. Many of the names matched missing U.S. personnel, soldiers presumed captured months earlier. But next to each name, there was a single, coded word. Later, translators confirmed its meaning: cooperative. It was then the Allies realized that the enemy's propaganda didn't rely on imagination alone. It relied on voices that once spoke from their own side. At the heart of Werner's operations stood a place few in Germany knew existed: Camp 186, hidden in the outskirts of Hamburg. Officially, it was classified as a prisoner of war holding site. In truth, it was a laboratory of the human mind. The camp didn't look unusual from the outside: rows of wooden barracks, barbed wire, guard towers. But inside, the routine was different. Prisoners were well fed, treated politely, even offered small comforts rare in captivity. Yet behind every gesture of kindness lay a purpose. Werner's team called it the recruitment program. It began subtly. Captured soldiers were separated from others and questioned not about tactics, but about life, their hometowns, families, and memories. At first, the conversations seemed harmless, a few questions to pass time, but the real aim was to measure resilience. Those showing fatigue, disillusion, or guilt were marked for further attention. Weeks of isolation followed. No violence, no threats, just quiet pressure, the slow unraveling of certainty. The prisoners were reminded that their families might never know where they were, that their war was far from over, that surrender didn't end conflict, it only changed the battlefield. Werner's psychologists knew what exhaustion could do. They played American music over loudspeakers, broadcast old radio shows, gave newspapers with carefully edited headlines. Each step reminded prisoners of home, then twisted that comfort into doubt. Soon the first offers appeared. Those willing to assist with cultural studies were moved to warmer quarters. They were told they could help shorten the war, perhaps even save lives. All they needed to do was write letters, short articles, notes, words that sounded American, words that could reach soldiers still in the field. Many refused, but some, overwhelmed by fear and isolation, agreed. They weren't told how their writings would be used.
They were told they were helping communication experiments. The first leaflets written by these men began circulating in France. Their tone was unmistakable, not from an outsider, but from someone who knew the soldier's world. The taste of field rations, the smell of damp boots, the ache of cold nights. Only a fellow American could describe those things so clearly. Werner understood the power of authenticity. He wasn't asking these men to betray their country outright. He asked them to express frustration, homesickness, longing. Then his editors rewrote the pieces, turning emotion into persuasion.
Some prisoners, under constant pressure, went further. They agreed to record their voices for short radio segments. These broadcasts began with familiar American phrases, "Fellas, back home we used to," before gently pushing the idea that the war was senseless. To listeners on the front, the voices sounded real, because they were. But not all who participated did so willingly. Some believed their cooperation would protect fellow prisoners. Others hoped for better treatment. A few were simply too exhausted to resist. In psychological terms, they weren't traitors. They were victims of methodical manipulation, stripped of agency until compliance felt like survival. Years later, declassified interrogations confirmed that some prisoners genuinely believed they were saving lives. If men stopped fighting, one explained after the war, fewer would die. That reasoning, though naive, showed how far the operation had reached into moral grayness. Warner's team documented every step. They studied tone, phrasing, emotional response. Each prisoner's writing became part of a growing database, the enemy learning in real time how Americans thought under pressure.
By autumn 1944, the program was producing leaflets at industrial scale. Each text carried traces of genuine American voice. Soldiers on the front lines could feel it, the rhythm of sentences, the idioms, the slang. It wasn't imitation anymore, it was reflection. Intelligence analysts back in London soon realized that some of the propaganda bore uncanny resemblance to real letters home. Certain phrases matched captured correspondence word for word. That discovery led to an unsettling question. Were prisoners being forced to read each other's mail? In truth, Werner's facility collected intercepted letters from multiple sources: downed mail planes, captured couriers, and postal seizures from occupied territories. These letters were dissected, categorized, and sometimes handed to American POWs to inspire authentic tone. To Werner, language was a mirror. The more perfectly he could reflect the American mind, the more powerful his message became. Yet even he underestimated the moral cost. Some prisoners, upon realizing how their words had been twisted, withdrew into silence. A few fell ill. One attempted escape and vanished in the forest beyond the camp's fence. His fate was never recorded.
By late 1944, Camp 186 had become both a factory and a graveyard of conscience, a place where loyalty eroded one compromise at a time. The operation's success alarmed even German intelligence officers, who feared the campaign was growing uncontrollable. But Werner pressed on, convinced that psychological warfare could do what armies could not. He believed that truth, reshaped and repeated, could make even the most steadfast soldier doubt his cause. And in the icy forests of Belgium, his theory was about to be tested. By autumn 1944, American headquarters across Europe were receiving the same reports: leaflets too personal to ignore, radio voices too convincing to dismiss, and soldiers asking questions that no commander wanted to hear. At first, these incidents were scattered. Then they became a pattern. Something unseen was threading through the ranks, subtle, persuasive, and precise. What began as annoyance had become an infiltration. The U.S. Army finally gave it a name: psychological contamination.
The alarm reached London. Inside a converted building near Grosvenor Square, a new division came to life, the Psychological Warfare Division, formed not to spread propaganda, but to defend against it. The man chosen to lead this effort was Major Vincent Ross, a civilian-turned-soldier with a background few in uniform understood. Before the war, Ross had been an advertising executive in New York, a man who built emotion into campaigns, who knew how words could shift public opinion as surely as a headline could move markets. Now, his skills were being used for something entirely different, saving minds instead of shaping them. Ross arrived in France in late 1944 with a small team of analysts, linguists, and cultural specialists. Their task was daunting: trace the source of the enemy's information, identify how it reached the front, and, above all, stop it from spreading. Their first step was education. Ross ordered field briefings across the European theater. Soldiers were gathered in small groups, shown captured leaflets, and warned that the enemy's greatest weapon wasn't always a bullet. These messages, instructors explained, are designed to make you question, not surrender. They taught troops to recognize the patterns: half-truths, exaggerated statistics, emotional hooks. Soldiers were told to report, not destroy, any leaflet they found. Every scrap of paper, every line of text became a clue. But defense required more than awareness. The Germans weren't simply lying, they were twisting reality. So Ross's division began crafting countermaterials, pamphlets, bulletins, and broadcasts that reminded soldiers why they fought. One campaign used real letters from home, unedited, hopeful, honest. Another shared short stories of units that had stood firm despite deception. The tone was simple and direct. Where the enemy whispered doubt, these messages spoke of unity. Ross understood that propaganda's power lay in isolation. It worked best when men felt alone. So he focused on connection, building morale from within. Chaplains, officers, and even mail clerks were instructed to talk openly about the enemy's tactics. Naming the threat robbed it of mystery. Yet behind a reassurance, Ross faced a troubling truth. The Germans knew too much. Each leaflet seemed more specific than the last, referencing small towns, quoting letters that should have been private. Counterintelligence agents began examining how American correspondents traveled. Mail was censored for operational security, but the volume was immense. Somewhere, somehow, the enemy was finding a way in.
Investigators suspected intercepted mail routes through neutral territories, perhaps even captured postal workers. Some speculated that pre-war sympathizers in Europe had kept contact networks alive. Whatever the method, the precision of German messaging was undeniable. In one instance, a leaflet addressed to a Midwestern unit mentioned a strike at a steel plant in Ohio, an event that had occurred less than 2 weeks earlier. The accuracy stunned analysts. It meant the enemy's intelligence channels were not only active, but fast. Ross knew the psychological battle couldn't be won by censorship alone. Soldiers needed purpose, stronger than propaganda. He urged commanders to reinforce meaning, to remind men of what their struggle represented. It wasn't about politics or perfection. It was about each other. But as the campaign grew, cracks appeared. Reports surfaced from field chaplains describing soldiers who refused to read newspapers from home, convinced they were tainted. Some units showed signs of fatigue, not from combat, but from confusion. Men whispered that maybe the leaflets were right. Maybe their leaders didn't understand them.
Racial tensions, long buried under discipline, began to surface. African American soldiers confronted uncomfortable truths the propaganda exploited.
White officers struggled to answer questions they'd never been trained to face. Ross realized the Germans hadn't invented division, they had exposed it. And that made the problem far harder to fight. He shifted focus again. Instead of denying the truth behind the propaganda, his division began reframing it. They acknowledged inequality, but highlighted progress, solidarity, and shared sacrifice. "We don't need to pretend," Ross told his team. "We just need to remind them what they're fighting for and who stands beside them." His approach worked better than expected. Soldiers responded to honesty. They knew hardship. What they needed was belief that even imperfect unity was worth defending. Meanwhile, field operatives traced intercepted communications back toward German-held territory. There were rumors of a facility near Frankfurt, heavily guarded, brimming with printing equipment. But without confirmation, it remained a ghost target. By December, as snow began falling again across Europe, the leaflets reached their most sophisticated stage. Some no longer looked like propaganda at all. They resembled American newspapers, complete with weather updates and sports results. Others quoted real casualty numbers, accurate to the day. It was no longer a question of if the enemy was listening. It was now how much they knew. Ross's team worked through sleepless nights, piecing together fragments, chasing leads through a fog of misinformation. Their mission was clear: find the source before the enemy's words broke more than morale. The propaganda had proven one thing: even the strongest army could be shaken from within. Now the Americans were determined to return the fight. October 1944. The front lines were pushing east, but behind them, a different kind of hunt had begun. For months, Major Vincent Ross and his division had been collecting fragments, leaflets, transcripts, intercepted broadcasts. Each carried pieces of truth stitched into lies. But the question remained: how did the enemy know so much? The answer came not from theory, but from a battlefield accident. Outside Aachen, an American patrol captured a small German communications post hidden in a farmhouse cellar. Inside, they found stacks of coded messages, radio logs, and printing proofs, all written in English. When analysts in London decrypted the material, what they uncovered sent shock waves through Allied command. Among the papers were detailed profiles of American soldiers, not generals or officers, ordinary men. Each file listed name, hometown, family background, even religious affiliation. Some included summaries of personal letters, word for word. Others carried notes about morale, recent losses, or opinions about leadership. The handwriting was precise, the organization methodical. The enemy wasn't guessing, they were cataloging. Further investigation revealed the source: not spies in uniform, but a vast network built from captured information. Through occupied territories, the Germans had seized control of postal routes once used for Allied correspondence. Letters from soldiers traveling through France or Belgium were sometimes rerouted, copied, and delayed before ever reaching home. In neutral countries, sympathetic intermediaries forwarded American newspapers, allowing German analysts to track events in small towns. Even more alarming, before America's entry into the war, members of the German-American Bund, a pro-German organization operating within the United States, had collected data about local communities, factories, and ethnic groups. Many of those records, shipped to Europe before 1941, now resurfaced as raw material for propaganda. Every leaflet that struck a nerve had roots in reality. Ross's team pored over the captured documents. Each section was labeled by theme: race relations, economic division, religious identity. Under each heading, German analysts had compiled articles, speeches, and excerpts from American publications. They weren't inventing conflict, they were amplifying it. Then came the most disturbing discovery. Among the files were envelopes marked with American post office codes. Inside were carbon copies of censored letters, real correspondence that should have been secure. It became clear that during the chaos of early campaigns, several field mail centers had been overrun, their archives seized. The Germans had carefully preserved the letters, studied handwriting styles, and extracted emotional details for use in their messaging. One folder contained a letter from a private in Pennsylvania riddled to his mother. He described missing Christmas dinner, worrying about the mortgage back home. Weeks later, leaflets quoting those same concerns began circulating near his division. The words weren't changed, only the author was. Ross understood the scale now. This wasn't propaganda in isolation. It was a mirror built from stolen reflections. The Germans weren't just observing the American army, they were reading its heart.
Reports were rushed to Supreme Headquarters. Commanders were briefed behind closed doors. Some refused to believe the reach of the operation. Others saw it as a warning. If soldiers knew how much the enemy understood them, fear could spread faster than truth. To prevent panic, the findings were classified. Only senior intelligence officers and select counter-propaganda units were informed. Ross's team began tracking leads from the captured files. Many pointed towards central Germany, near Frankfurt. Intercepts from reconnaissance aircraft confirmed heavy communication traffic in that region, unusually high for a non-combat zone. Hidden among industrial complexes, they suspected, was the facility directing the psychological campaign, the source of Operation Scorpion. But the discovery raised another question. How long had this been going on? Buried within the files were documents dated as early as 1941, long before American troops landed in Europe. They included pre-war sociological studies, surveys of American radio programs, and transcripts from U.S. newspapers. The enemy had been preparing for years. One analyst remarked, "They studied us like a nation studies itself."
In Berlin, George Werner's operation continued with chilling precision. He read every captured report, using the data to refine his messages. Each success confirmed his belief that democracy could be undone with its own words. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, Ross realized the implications extended beyond the battlefield. If propaganda could manipulate soldiers in war, what could it do to citizens in peace? He began drafting internal memoranda, warning that future conflicts might be fought in newspapers and broadcasts rather than trenches. But first, they had to stop Werner. Through signals intelligence, Allied cryptographers traced a pattern. Encrypted radio bursts transmitted nightly from Frankfurt, often synchronized with leaflet drops. The content of the messages suggested coordination between printing units and frontline distributors. The race was on. Allied intelligence planned air reconnaissance and covert infiltration to locate the facility. Every day of delay meant more misinformation reaching the front. In late November, agents recovered another trove of documents from a retreating German convoy. Among them were updated morale charts color-coded by division. Each unit was graded by susceptibility: strong, stable, vulnerable. The detail was staggering. Some assessments were remarkably accurate, matching U.S. internal morale reports never meant to leave command desks. Someone, somewhere, had access to information too sensitive for public release. The possibility of compromised communication channels loomed again. Military couriers were investigated, encryption methods rechecked, but no single breach was found. It was as if the Germans were reading between the lines of American culture itself. By December, Ross knew what they were facing. The leaflets, the broadcasts, the stolen letters, all were part of a grander architecture designed to measure and manipulate. The propaganda wasn't just speaking to soldiers. It was studying them. Every reaction, every rumor, every change in the RAL provided feedback for Werner's team, allowing them to adapt and improve. It was psychological warfare as experiment. War fought not in trenches, but in mines mapped like terrain. The Americans had uncovered the machine, but the machine was still running. And as the Ardennes prepared for winter, intelligence warned of something imminent, a surge in psychological operations timed to coincide with a major German offensive. Whatever Werner was planning, it would not remain hidden much longer.
December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried under snow, silent except for the crack of frozen branches and distant artillery. American troops scattered across the front believed the German army was broken. The war, they thought, was nearing its end. They were wrong. At dawn on December 16, the forest erupted. German armor surged through the mist, cutting across Allied lines with speed and precision. It was the beginning of the last great German offensive, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge. Caught in confusion, outnumbered, and under fire, the Americans faced chaos on every front. But amid the shock and noise, another assault began, one without guns. The propaganda campaign, long prepared in secret, was unleashed in full force. Within hours of the attack, Allied units began finding fresh leaflets drifting through the sky. They weren't the crude threats soldiers had seen before. These were polished, urgent, and strangely intimate. "Command has abandoned you," one read. Another warned, "You are surrounded. Lay down your arms. Live to see home."
Others carried forged orders claiming that American divisions were retreating. A few even included fake signatures of known generals. To a soldier cut off in snow and static, the difference between truth and imitation became dangerously thin. Radio frequencies filled with new voices, calm, American, familiar. "This is not surrender," one broadcast insisted. "This is survival." In besieged positions, soldiers huddled around makeshift fires, listening to enemy transmissions that echoed in perfect English. The broadcasts quoted real casualty figures, spoke of lost supply lines, even named towns under siege. Every detail sounded authentic, because much of it was. For the men trapped in the Ardennes, surrounded by darkness and cold, the propaganda struck harder than shells. In one isolated pocket near St. Vith, a platoon discovered leaflets listing names of soldiers from their own regiment, men captured weeks earlier. The message beneath read, "They are safe now. You can be too." Some began to wonder if surrender might truly mean survival. Others tore the leaflets apart and threw them into the snow. But no one could deny how deep the words cut. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne found themselves encircled. Supplies were dwindling. The temperature dropped below freezing. Every night, German loudspeakers broke the silence, playing swing music followed by measured voices offering mercy. "Why die here?" they asked. "Your leaders have forgotten you." For hours, the broadcasts continued, drifting across frozen air like ghostly conversations from home. Inside the besieged town, officers held meetings by candlelight, aware that morale hung by a thread. Some men laughed at the broadcasts. Others stared quietly into the dark. The line between endurance and despair grew thin. Werner's operation had reached its ultimate test. Everything he'd built, the research, the manipulation, the psychological insight, converged here, in this frozen forest. If the propaganda could fracture these men now, victory might still be possible. But something unexpected happened. The same hardship the Germans tried to exploit began binding soldiers together. In the face of relentless bombardment and isolation, race and class lost meaning. Men shared rations, traded gloves, covered each other from the cold.
Letters from home, once sources of fear, became tokens of hope. The leaflets still fell, the broadcast still played, but they began to sound hollow. Soldiers mocked the messages, reading them aloud as jokes. They scribbled replies on the back and sent them flying toward enemy lines. What Werner hadn't understood was that unity under pressure was different from unity in comfort. The very struggle meant to divide the Americans had instead fused them.
At Bastogne, when German negotiators demanded surrender, the American response was short and defiant. Though the famous reply became legend, what mattered most was not the word itself, but the spirit behind it. The propaganda had failed to break their resolve. In nearby forests, other units fought surrounded, cut off from command. Some never received clear orders, yet continued to resist. The false broadcasts promising mercy now seemed desperate. The enemy's calm tone betrayed their frustration. Werner's team monitored intercepted communications, expecting collapse. Instead, they heard reports of growing defiance. Soldiers began collecting leaflets not as warnings, but as souvenirs, proof that they'd faced the enemy's mind games and endured. Even within Germany, doubts emerged. A few members of Werner's own staff began to question the purpose of the operation. They saw the reports. Instead of division, the propaganda had sparked resistance. Instead of confusion, it had awakened resolve. Meanwhile, on the American side, Major Ross and his analysts tracked morale closely. The results surprised even them. Units that had endured the worst conditions showed the highest cohesion. Shared hardship, Ross wrote in his notes, can inoculate against manipulation. The Germans had built their campaign on an assumption that America's internal differences would shatter under stress. But the Ardennes proved the opposite. When tested by isolation and fear, those differences faded. What remained was something propaganda couldn't reach: loyalty born not from ideology, but from necessity. As January approached, the offensive faltered. Fuel shortages, weather, and Allied resistance slowed the German advance. By the time skies cleared and air support returned, the counterattack began. American units, battered and frozen, pushed forward again. The leaflets stopped falling. The broadcasts fell silent. For Werner, it was a bitter revelation. His operation had struck every nerve, but failed to break the heart. He had measured America's fractures with precision, but misread its strength. He once told his team that democracy's weakness was disagreement. He never realized that disagreement could also forge endurance, that freedom's noise was not fragility, but life. As the snow began to melt, the propaganda scattered across the battlefield, trampled beneath boots and tank tracks. The messages that once carried fear now lay buried in the mud. The Germans had unleashed their final psychological weapon, and in that crucible of winter, the Americans had found something the enemy could never manufacture: faith in one another. When the battle ended, the soldiers didn't speak of leaflets or broadcasts. They remembered the cold, the hunger, the silence, but beneath it all, they carried something else: the quiet knowledge that unity, once tested, could survive anything. The propaganda war had met reality, and in that meeting, truth had endured. January 1945. Germany's final gamble in the Ardennes had failed. The great offensive was collapsing, and the front lines were shifting once more. But even as tanks withdrew when guns fell silent, Allied intelligence continued the quieter pursuit, the hunt for the man behind the psychological war. For weeks, analysts at the Psychological Warfare Division had followed fragments of intercepted signals, cross-referencing them with aerial reconnaissance and captured documents. Each clue pointed toward a single region: the industrial outskirts of Frankfurt.
Hidden among warehouses and factories stood a complex that, to reconnaissance aircraft, looked like an ordinary printing facility. But radio triangulation confirmed unusual activity, steady transmissions, coded bursts, and messages in English routed across occupied territories. Ross and his team knew they had found it, the source of Operation Scorpion. An air raid was scheduled at dawn. Bomber crews were briefed that their target was a communications hub. Only a handful of officers knew the truth. This was the beating heart of the enemy's propaganda machine. When the first wave arrived, the sky above Frankfurt was heavy with smoke. Bombs struck with precision, tearing through the compound. Fires rose from printing halls, scattering fragments of leaflets into the air. The very messages once designed to undermine America now fluttered uselessly over German streets.
Inside, chaos consumed Werner's operation. Files burned, machines twisted under collapsing beams. Technicians fled into the snow. Those who survived were captured within days as Allied ground forces moved in. Among the wreckage, investigators uncovered crates of printed material awaiting distribution, thousands of leaflets written in flawless English, ready for airdrop. Some carried the seal of American field offices, so convincing that even trained eyes hesitated. But it was the documents in the lower levels that stunned intelligence officers most. Locked rooms held filing cabinets filled with soldier profiles, analysis reports, and psychological assessments. Charts graded entire divisions by loyalty under stress. Diaries of captured POWs were marked with handwritten notes detailing emotional triggers, words, memories, themes that caused hesitation. It was an archive of manipulation, a map of the American mind built from stolen voices. When Ross received the report, he ordered the contents classified immediately. He said, "These are not trophies, they're warnings." Within days, Allied interrogators located the remains of Camp 186, the facility near Hamburg that had supplied voices for Werner's propaganda. Inside, they found evidence of the recruitment program, writing samples, forged letters, and recording transcripts bearing unmistakably American phrasing. The revelation cut deep. Among the documents were lists of captured soldiers who had participated, some willingly, others under pressure. Their cooperation posed a painful question. Were they victims, collaborators, or something in between? Military authorities debated how to respond. Some called for court-martial, others for understanding. Testimonies from survivors painted a complex picture: exhaustion, deception, and moral confusion rather than betrayal. Many had believed they were helping end the war. Few understood how their words had been twisted. For Ross, the discovery reinforced what he'd feared since the beginning. Propaganda wasn't just about lies. It was about bending truth until it broke under the weight of emotion. In the ruins of Frankfurt, Allied investigators pieced together the story of the operation. They found evidence linking Werner's facility to captured mail centers, intercepted broadcasts, and coded instructions from Berlin's propaganda ministry. Each file told a story of precision, patience, and an enemy who had turned knowledge into a weapon. But George Werner himself was gone. Witnesses claimed he fled the compound during the air raid, disappearing into the smoke. Others reported seeing a man matching his description, boarding a military truck headed east. Some believed he tried to reach Berlin. Others thought he sought refuge among the chaos of fleeing civilians. Despite weeks of search, no trace of him was found. His name vanished from post-war records. In time, his fate became another mystery buried beneath Germany's ruins. What remained, however, was undeniable. The operation had been crippled. Without its mastermind, the network collapsed. German broadcasts lost their precision. The flow of new propaganda ceased almost overnight. For the first time,
Soldiers on the front received confirmation that the psychological assault was over. Leaflets stopped falling. The strange voices on the radio went silent. Yet victory carried no celebration. In recovered files, Ross's team found the outlines of planned expansions, proposals for targeting not just soldiers, but American civilians. Newspapers, broadcasts, and correspondence had all been listed as future channels of influence. If the war had lasted longer, the battle for mines might have reached across the ocean itself.
The destruction of Werner's facility ended that threat, but it also forced the Allies to confront a haunting realization that such a campaign could exist at all. As the snow melted across Germany, investigators sealed the documents in steel containers and shipped them to London for analysis. They would remain locked away for decades. For now, the psychological war was over. The mind that designed it had vanished. And though the printing presses were silent, the echoes of their work lingered. In memories, in mistrust, in the quiet awareness that even the strongest armies could be reached without a single shot. Werner had failed to divide America, but in revealing how deeply he understood its people, he had exposed something far greater, that freedom, though resilient, was not immune to doubt. When the war ended, the world celebrated. Cities lit up, flags rose, soldiers came home. But among those who had faced the hidden front, the battle of words, whispers, and illusions, the triumph felt different. For them, victory carried questions. In the months that followed, the U.S. Army launched studies to assess the damage caused by the enemy's psychological warfare. Teams of historians, psychiatrists, and intelligence officers combed through the records, interviewing returning veterans. Their findings were mixed. On paper, Operation Scorpion had achieved little measurable success. No large-scale surrenders could be traced directly to propaganda. Morale, though tested, had held. In purely tactical terms, the campaign had failed, but the numbers told only part of the story.
Beneath the statistics lay something harder to define, an unease that lingered long after the leaflets stopped falling. Some soldiers admitted that certain messages had haunted them for years. The words had been too precise, too personal. They spoke of doubts men rarely voiced aloud. Others said they began questioning how much the enemy had truly known. Some recalled hearing their hometowns mentioned in broadcasts, details no one should have recognized. They wondered who had listened, who had written, who had been watching all along. Even decades later, those questions never left.
Psychologists studying post-war adjustment noted a subtle pattern among veterans of the Ardennes, a quiet mistrust of information, a reluctance to believe what they read or heard. For men once targeted by manipulation, certainty had become fragile. Then there were the families. Many never knew that their letters, written with love and longing, had been intercepted, copied, and weaponized. Some mothers unknowingly provided the very words that appeared in enemy leaflets. To protect morale, officials chose not to reveal the truth. The documents were sealed under classification orders that would last for generations.
Even within the Army, knowledge of the campaign remained compartmentalized. Command feared that acknowledging how close the propaganda had come might undermine confidence in military security. So the story was buried, hidden behind codes, stamped confidential, and filed away. For the soldiers who had lived through it, silence became the only answer. They spoke of battles, not broadcasts, of trenches, not leaflets. The war of the mind faded into rumor, half remembered, half believed. But for those captured and drawn into Werner's recruitment program, the aftermath was heavier.
When Allied investigators uncovered Camp 186, they found lists of American names, men who had written or spoken under duress. After their liberation, some were quietly questioned. A few were cleared immediately, their cooperation deemed coerced. Others were less fortunate. Whispers followed them home. In a time when loyalty was sacred, even a hint of compromise carried shame. Many withdrew into silence, unable to explain the impossible choices they had faced. Years later, declassified reports would reveal that none had acted out of ideology. All were victims of psychological pressure, exhaustion, fear, isolation. Yet for decades they bore the weight alone. The propaganda war left no ruins, no graves, but its casualties were real. It had exposed how fragile conviction could be when tested by uncertainty, and how even the most steadfast soldier could feel the pull of doubt.
In closed meetings, military scholars debated the ethics of it all. Could truth itself become a battlefield? Could empathy, when weaponized, do more harm than hatred? Those questions had no simple answer. What was clear, however, was the lesson that faith in purpose, in one another, was as vital as ammunition, and when shaken, it took longer to rebuild. For many veterans, the victory in Europe was shadowed by a quiet realization. They had survived bullets and bombardments, but what scarred deepest was the knowledge that the enemy had once reached into their most private fears and nearly made them doubt themselves. The propaganda war had ended, but its echoes lived on, in sleepless nights, in unspoken memories, in the uneasy recognition that even the strongest hearts could be touched by unseen hands.